Hello and welcome back to the Robin Zander Show. I am so excited to sit down with my dear friend Jenny Sauer-Klein. Jenny and I go way back, but haven't seen each other in 3 or 4 years. Jenny is the former co-founder of AcroYoga and was a big part of me originally learning how to run in-person large events. She's an incredible experience designer who runs Scaling Intimacy, which is a school of experience design for facilitators and organizations trying to create ways in which people virtually or in person can come together. Thank you for sitting down for an interview.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. It was nice to hear from you out of the blue.
It was fun in preparing for this interview to realize that our last interview was late 2015. And there was a span of my life personally and professionally where you were profoundly impactful. The founding of Robin's Cafe, getting really started with Responsive Conference. And most people listening or watching don't know, but Design for Dance was a conference I ran before Responsive. I have so many questions and so many places to dive in, but the phrase, right, like the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. Things like experience design, things like creating a compelling experience at work are now much more in the zeitgeist and much more commonplace than they were last time I saw you in 2018, in the year 2022. How has your work as an experience designer changed in the last 4 years?
Well, obviously pandemic. My business was all about teaching people how to lead interactive, engaging, in-person events by leading in-person events. So it was very much, everything I do is very meta. That's kind of like the inside joke is like my favorite word is meta. So it's like, how many levels of meta can I have going at one time? So I like to teach people by demonstrating what we're doing. And so then pulling back the curtain and saying, do you see how we're following the frameworks and living the experience? Because I feel like that's the most effective way to teach. And so during that time, I would, of course, get people that were asking me about remote, about hybrid, about virtual. And I was like, yeah, like, you tell me what you find out. And I would just like punt it down the road. And then when the pandemic hit, I definitely went through like a morning for probably about a week and a half or 2 weeks where I was like, man, like, I had just gotten to the point in my career where I felt like everything was dialed the way I wanted it, the impact, the lifestyle, time off, like who I was working with, the money I was making, all the things. It was like, yeah, I found the sweet spot and then it all crumbled. And I was like, man, that sucks.
I'm going to come back to it, but that speed, right? You were mourning for a week and a half.
Yeah, it wasn't that long.
You have the ability to adjust so quickly. And that's something that I've admired in you for as long as I've known you. So and we'll come back to the story of how we met because even that is like dear to me, but keep going.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a deep morning. I went deep and strong for a while. And then, no one knew, of course, how long the pandemic would be. But at that time, I was like, either I sit on my ass and wait this out and put everything on hold, which is just not my nature. Anyone who knows me well will tell you I'm not good at waiting. I don't have a lot of patience in that regard. And then I was like, okay, well, let me just use this as an opportunity to discover what is possible online. And thankfully, I had literally maybe a week or two after the pandemic really came down, a follow-up session with this mastermind group I had been leading. And so we were doing this weekend of like business and marketing and sales. And I decided, I was like, either we cancel it, we postpone it, or we put it online. And I was like, let me put it online and it will give me an opportunity to practice in a safe environment with people who I trust. And we're in this learning environment together. And so I basically took myself through this crash course of learning online and then led 2 6-hour days online with this group of, I don't know, it was like 12 of us. And after that, we learned a lot together during that time. And I was like, oh, this is possible. I can do this. And I started making just like constant micro experiments, bringing people together, trying to translate all of the interactive games and activities, icebreakers that I knew in real life into these virtual scenarios, and then built out a whole nother branch of Play on Purpose, which is my online video tutorial library for icebreakers and team building games, recorded 30 more virtual versions of those games and a whole bunch of new stuff. And then I do feel like experience design which is kind of the term that I've been using. It's a bit confusing because most people are familiar with experience design in a UX or UI context, right?
Sure.
So there's some conflict
Digital
around
experience design versus human.
Yeah, that's kind of how I say it. It's like, well, you might think of UX, UI, and that's kind of human to digital or human to machine. And experience design, the way we're talking about it, is transformational human to human experiences.
Right. And I, as a circus performer, immediately default to like experience design means, stage performance, engaging an audience.
Right.
Digital is important, but that's
right. So, yeah. And they're all true, right? They're all variations on a theme. Yeah. But I think in this regard, one of the beautiful things about the pandemic and things breaking so intensely was that the things I think that were already broken just came more to light. Like what we had been used to as status quo of like a 45-minute keynote where everyone sits and checks their email and waits for it to be over and is disengaged and bored and frustrated and drained by the end of a long day of back-to-back speakers. All of a sudden that is brought to light in a way that's like, okay, we need to address this. These paradigms are broken anyway. Now we have to port things online. And I always say to people, anything that might be a little bit boring in person is going to be 10 times more boring online. So that thing you did and thought was good enough is just not going to cut it online if you want to keep people's attention.
I'm going to come back and very selfishly ask advice on how to run our Zander Media weekly, hour-long, all hands better.
Gotcha.
So we'll come back to
Happy to brainstorm about that. So that was a huge thing of like, okay, we all need to be in a reinvention space. And what I found during that time was so much generosity and so much ingenuity and so much innovation and so much people in this field being so willing to share what they were learning and so much humanity coming forward because we were all stumbling together and understanding that tech had its limitations. And we were all trying to hack Zoom to be like, how do we make Zoom a platform for human connection and authenticity instead of just like SlideShare. And I think Zoom has been catching up along the way, obviously. But I think all of that was incredibly invigorating, actually. And I think we all found out that there were ways absolutely to make experiences and experience design come alive in a virtual format where people actually made real life friends, collaborators, mentors, business partners, all kinds of things. Magic was happening online. And I think it caused us all to innovate beyond where the online forum had been in a beautiful way. And then what I'm finding now, the trend is that now that experience design is a little bit more in, as you said, in the zeitgeist of like people being aware it's not just slapping content back to back and calling that an offsite. It's like that doesn't actually get us there. It's just like a checkbox, so to speak. That it has to be a more holistic picture. Now I think what's coming up as more of the world continues to be online is this need for facilitation. And experience design and facilitation go hand in hand.
I was going to say.
Right? Because the experience design is the plan, it's the strategy, it's the roadmap, right? It's like, here's the agenda or the curriculum. This is what we envision happening and how we're going to do it. And then the facilitation is how you make that plan come alive in the room. It's actually taking the journey of the roadmap and like being in the terrain, in the 3D instead of just like the topographical. So that's how I like to think about it. And I think that now people are perhaps getting a little bit more creative or risk-taking in their agenda, or they're having a little bit more of a holistic picture of what needs to happen. But then how to actually make that come alive, how to be what I think of as the balance between structure and spontaneity. Structure being our plan, spontaneity being the facilitation in the moment when something else is needed or our plan goes askew. The group needs something that we didn't prepare for. Time runs short, time runs long, whatever it is. There's dissenters, there's chaos, there's whatever. People arrive late. You have to adapt to what's in the moment. And so I think now there's becoming this understanding that anyone who is a leader of any kind needs to also be a facilitator. Like anyone who's a manager, anybody who's running a meeting, anyone even who's doing a one-on-one, like you could also say similar to coaching skills, right? It's like we need these human skills to be able to draw out the best possibilities in a group, right? It's like, how do we draw out, especially if we have 30 minutes, we have however that limited time is, how do we pull out the best outcomes in that amount of time? And that takes some finesse that, again, if you're just rotely following a plan, you just often don't get to the best outcomes.
Right. What then makes, so how would you define what a facilitator is? I love this distinction of experience design is the plan, the facilitation, or the facilitator is the person doing it. What makes a good facilitator? And is that something that you can, or that one can learn to do well? Because certainly, you know, people have natural proclivities. And I want to come to play on purpose and where I've seen your exercises work really well. And it's so fun all these years later where I see exercises that I know to be your invention on stages out in the world. And I think of you and know that nobody else here knows that this is actually something that you created. So we'll come back to that too. But a leader, a manager, somebody in a position of power needs to be a good, skilled facilitator. How do you make that happen? How does one make that happen?
Yeah, I think there definitely is. There are roadmaps. There are ways. I do think, yes, there are some people who are more naturally inclined, and that's probably people, I would say a lot of facilitation, similar to experience design, has to do with empathy, right? So it's like both feeling myself and listening to my instincts, my intuition, but also really being able to empathize with my group and being able to adjust in the moment, right? Again, I think it's that difference between someone who is just executing what's on paper versus someone who is awake and alive and present and responsive to what's happening and what's needed in a way. And I think I would say, like, you know, I was talking about facilitation and experience design is like you learn classical and then you play jazz, right? So it's like first you get super duper detailed in your plan, you think through all the things A to Z, and then over time you get more facile and you get more agile and you're able to kind of improvise your way through things more. You need less details because you kind of know how it is, and you get a felt sense for the group, and you get a sense for like, oh, are people bored? Is the energy dropping? Is there confusion? Is there like misalignment? So I think part of facilitation is doing it over and over and over and over.
Practice.
There's no way to get better at it without doing it over and over again. Secondly, to have some kind of a reflective process. And this is part of why I always say to people, like, facilitation is the kind of bachelor's degree and co-facilitation is the graduate degree.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have the ability to co-facilitate or co-lead with someone else, I think it's such a huge opportunity for growth and learning, because then you have someone who's your peer who is witnessing you and reflecting to you. And if you can debrief with that person every time, what went well, what did we like, what did I appreciate, love about the way you did this, about this session, about our participants, the way they, came in. And then like, what could we do better next time? Or what could be even better if? It'd be even better if before you gave the instructions, you gave a personal example of how that had come up in your life. Because I think then our audience would be able to relate to you in a more human way, right? Whatever that is. So I've spent most of my career co-facilitating. And for me, that has been the, I think, biggest key to unlocking my potential as a facilitator, is just having that reflective process every single time so that you're constantly optimizing how you show up in a room. And it also means that your partner doesn't allow you to go on autopilot. Because like for all of us, the things that we do all the time, it's really easy to tell the same stories and give the same examples and just be in your kind of robotic thing. So it just forces you to constantly have to refresh and renew and expand. And I think it's just a beautiful practice. And there's specific skills, of course, that you can train in a lot of great tools out there. And we're going to be launching a public facilitation course this fall. Cool. So that's exciting. Because I do feel like I've been doing more and more private trainings with companies, and it's not just for the L&D people, it's for managers, it's for people at all levels of the organization.
Leadership development that is focused on facilitation.
They're just realizing that this is like a key skill that's necessary across the board.
Yeah. I've been really struck in the last 3.5 years at Zander Media and before that at the cafe and Responsive, but there's those moments that, or an external example is perfect, right? I'll spontaneously find myself on a sales call that I didn't realize was a sales call. And if I slept well last night and like am feeling in my power and it goes well, it has the potential to change the trajectory of the business for the next 3 months. And if it doesn't, because of the jackhammer that's going on across the street, right, that I'm irritated with, and I just woke up crabby that morning, like that's a lost moment and it's a lost opportunity. And I could dwell on that or not. That's a separate issue. But like those moments of high performance really, really matter. And, you know, as a facilitator, as maybe a primary facilitator at Zander Media too, how to hold that space when it matters the most has a huge potential impact, positive or negative, based on how I show up in that moment. I don't think I've ever told this story publicly. Every year I climb Mount Conness on the eastern side of the Sierra. And this was probably 2015 or 2016. I was climbing it with somebody I was in a relationship with and a dear friend. And we went down the wrong way. So Mount Conness is a 13,000-foot mountain that you can hike up or climb up, and we hike up it. On the way down, we went down the wrong ravine, maybe 20 yards down, and realized that it was a dead-end path into a glacier. Super, super narrow ravine with boulders at the top. And some of those smaller boulders started to roll down towards us. And like we got out fine. But I'm an emergency first responder, a wilderness first responder. I grew up in the mountains. Like I'm pretty comfortable in crisis when it comes to that sort of a natural environment. And I just was shaking afterwards, right? The three of us got out fine. We managed to get our way back up. No boulders hit anybody. Like it was okay. But my friend who was with us was so steady. And I asked him, like, my God, I am shaking after that experience. What did you do that you are so calm? And he said, I always try to leave 20% in the tank and never, ever go beyond 80% of my capacity so that when there is a crisis, I'm rock solid. And I don't do that. Like I routinely, stretch myself, to beyond what I think I'm capable of. But I've always been struck by that comment because I was at my wit's end and it was a life and death situation. And I was with somebody who was really calm and asking what we wanted to do and helped guide us out of there. And it made a world of difference.
Wow, it's impressive.
Yeah. And so thinking about in a moment of like facilitation can be really, really, really important. I mean, his name is Ted. I'll shout him out, Ted Madry. Like that's what he did in that moment was facilitate the three of us to calmly get out of an emergency situation.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of times in facilitation, it's taking a group and guiding them to a specific goal or outcome, right? And in that scenario, it was like, let's get out of this ravine alive. How are we going to do that? So, right, oftentimes we're like, we often hear about facilitation. Some people are familiar with the term holding space. It's like, what does that mean? And in a lot of ways, when we're facilitating, we are trying to be a neutral conduit, right? Or a channel where we are holding a container for a group to come to their own decisions, conclusions, collaborations, ideations, right? Oftentimes we're taking them through brainstorming or a decision-making process, right? So we are essentially holding the container and creating the process by which a group comes to its own outcomes or realizations. And so in doing that, we're not 100% neutral, right? It's like we come with our own thoughts and feelings and opinions. And so how much do you insert that or not? And when you look at the etymology of the word facilitation, it comes from the Greek word, I think it's facilis, which means to make easy, essentially. So that's what facilitation is supposed to be. It's really supposed to be a way in which we are making it easier for our group, our team, our participants to achieve whatever kind of purpose we've come together for.
Cool. I want to go very selfish and talk about facilitation at Zander Media, but before we do that, we're talking about these journeys of learning, and it's just so sweet to sit down with you because when we first met, you reached out to me, and we won't dive into your history if folks are interested. I'll link to our original interview and some of the work that we've done together. But you had just sold your stake in AcroYoga, and you were exploring what's next. And I was running a conference about the intersection of dance and behavior design. And you said, "Hey, I'm the founder of cold email. I'd never heard from Jenny. I had never heard of Jenny Sauer-Klein before.
I'm remembering that now.
Hey, I'm the co-founder of AcroYoga. I'm interested in speaking at your conference. Do you want to meet up?" Like that was how we met. And it was so cool to watch you over, those couple of years kind of go through this journey of leaving behind your global movement that you had built and discovering yourself as something that you've always been, but an experienced designer and building ecosystems and businesses around that. What was your journey of self-discovery now as you look back on those years? Right? Because that's an internal facilitated growth and trajectory.
Yeah, I think in the last, AcroYoga was 10 years of my life in a very dedicated and intense fashion. And I would say I was getting the the call to leave in the last probably 3 years that got stronger and stronger. And at that time, it was just terrifying because that was my life from 25 to 35, essentially. And, very formative years. And I was convinced early on that AcroYoga would be the thing I would do for the rest of my life. And that was like obvious. And so that kind of call to be like, you're supposed to do something else, like this is not the right thing anymore, was very disconcerting, disorienting, terrifying, because it was my lifestyle, it was my community, it was my livelihood, it was everything to me, and I had given everything to it and prioritized it above everything else. So when I finally hit my kind of my floor, so to speak, and I was like, it wasn't like I decided to leave, it was like the decision to leave had arrived. Yeah, I was like, you are leaving now. And I was like, okay, right, yes, that is just what needs to happen. And it was very clear and obvious, and it was just an acceptance at that time.
I should tell you at some point the story of deciding to leave the cafe.
Yes. Sometimes it
was very clear.
It's very clear.
Yeah.
And so then I knew, like, okay, now I just need to go through this process of completely destroying my identity and having to rediscover it. And that was part of what was keeping me from leaving, was the fear around the enormity of the process that would be.
Yep.
And so I had so much fear around it, and for good reason, because it was just an incredibly hard and grief-ridden, basically year and a half after I left, to just like work through all of the letting go and the regrets or the what ifs or any of that, or the who am I now?
The identity tied into the
absolutely.
business and the work.
I mean, people would literally be like, "Oh, are you Jenny AcroYoga?" It was like literally one and the same. And so, what I came to after time to reflect was that ultimately, I feel like at my core, I'm an artist and a creative and a teacher. And like, those are the things that I love. And my medium is what I would call like social artistry. Like, I love to work with people, and my focus ultimately is always around connection and community. They're the things that are the most important to me. So everything I've done up until now in life has that at its core, whether it's kind of frontal and, transparent upfront about that, or it's kind of a little bit more hidden. That's always what it's about. And that comes from my own journey of being a lonely only child and really wanting a bigger family and a bigger community in my own life, and therefore like creating it for other people. And then I get to experience it through them and with them as well. So that's been my whole journey. So that was a really good insight for me to recognize, like, I think the attachment to thinking this was going to be the end all be all forever was part of just young and naivete, whatever.
Sure.
And now I've come to recognize that, like, who I am at my core, because I am a creator, and I need and I love that energy of creation, means that I'm going to keep creating many things throughout my life. And right now I love Play on Purpose. I love scaling intimacy. Like, I'm fully committed to those things. And I have no illusion that that's what I'm going to be doing 10, 20, 30 years from now. Like, I don't know. I might be, but I might not. And I'm okay with that. I'm also like, my primary commitment is to being with what's most alive in my life, and like where my path is calling me, and where I can be of most service, both for myself and for others. And so that was very freeing to just be like, oh, I think my nature is to change. And I think some people are really great at having one career for their whole lives, and they're very consistent. And I think that's just not me.
Yeah, nor me. I relate.
Yeah, and so that I think has been very freeing to just be committed to the creative flow and process. And sometimes that means letting go of things that were very meaningful, things that you invested a lot of time and energy in, that are just no longer serving anymore.
You have an exercise, or at least I know it to be, like, I learned it from you, that I saw out in the wild recently, which is a group-wide game of Rochambeau, of rock, paper, scissors. And so, you have, if I were facilitating the group, everyone teams up with one other person and plays rock, paper, scissors. And then the winners of each group play with each other until there's only one person left. But the thing that makes this unique, and I think not just a giant game of rock, paper, scissors, but like an experience-designed experience, is the person who loses then turns around and becomes the winner's absolute biggest raving fan. And so by the end, you've got 4 or 6 or 8 people, and eventually 2 people, who have a group of people cheering them on and shouting their names as they're rock, paper, scissoring with their opponent, until eventually everyone is celebrating the winner and ultimately each other. Where this goes wrong is, and maybe this is the difference between experience design, which is the framework I just described, and the facilitation, which is the person who is guiding people to do that, is like, well, what if only a couple of people are playing? Or what if only a couple of people are celebrating? Or what if they're celebrating really quietly because they're nervous or afraid? And how do you set it up so that people are in it and not feeling self-conscious? Mm-hmm. Because that's what I've witnessed is people can have a game, but if you're at a conference with strangers and not everyone is playing the game, it falls flat. Is that a good distinction between this is experience design, the game, and then facilitation? And then what would you do to fix that, where the facilitation resulted in it not being as, like, I've felt the energy of those crowds that you facilitated at Responsive Conference and elsewhere, and they're ravenous, they're hungry, they're so full of energy. And that's something that I associate with the activities that I've seen you organize.
Yeah, I think that there's what you're speaking to. There is the design of the activity, and I always say, like, one of the principles I work with is that structure is your co-facilitator. So if you think through the plan well, if you think through the exercise well from both a strategic and empathic point of view, thinking about your audience, what's the impact going to be, what's the outcome that you want, how are you going to get them there, you can design on paper and the activity like that more or less will deliver the result with a decent facilitator, right? So it's like the better your plan is, the less skilled of a facilitator you need to deliver it.
Where are you trying to take people, right? Yeah. What is the outcome that you're aiming for? Because I think often for myself, especially in the weeds of the thick of a meeting, let's say at Zander Media, I'm not necessarily thinking about where I want to get to. I'm thinking about what is the problem that's right in front of me.
Right. So it's like, what is the outcome? And then how do we involve people in that process and the outcome? So first is like, okay, if structure is my co-facilitator, how do I think through this and design it as well as I possibly can? And then the delivery of that content is the facilitation. So in the moment, I mean, one of the pieces of feedback I get all the time from people, and I think, as you know, I love big groups, and that makes me somewhat unique because a lot of people don't like big groups.
This is something you and I have always talked about is I love small groups. I'm so comfortable in a group of 10 people. I'm increasingly, like I've been in front of audiences of thousands. I like that feeling of fear and that adrenaline, but like I'm still, all these years later, still scared of it, even though I pursue it and go towards it and do it.
And it can be very scary. And for most people, it's terrifying. So for the people that like it, it's like, okay, cool. That gives us some advantage. But for me, it's like one of the things that I constantly get as a piece of positive reflection is like, wow, you're just so confident. Like, when I recently did a workshop where I was inviting, it was actually with my mother-in-law, Katie Nelson, who you know is the co-founder of ODC Dance Company in San Francisco. And we were doing a workshop that with some dance pieces, but also some audience interaction of like, how do we get people to experience dance and not just watch dance, right? So they would watch some piece, and then I would invite them to do something, whether that was in their chair or actually at one point we brought them out onto the stage. And, you know, there's always that hesitation. There's always that moment where people are like, and they don't really want to, and it feels scary and whatever. And it's like, you as the facilitator in that moment, do you give in to that fear and hesitation and skepticism? And do you allow people to not participate, or do you make excuses, or do you undermine the ask, or do you stand in it and say, all right, here we go, like, let's do it? And so the energy that you bring as the facilitator does set the tone. And so I think that's where, like, I'm like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We do this, blah, blah, blah. And also it's like, as you know, I have a theater background, right? So for me, there's an ability to think about myself as having, and we all do have this incredibly wide spectrum, a range of being that we have access to. Most of us, our range of being is fairly narrow. Like, this is my personality. I'm a this kind of person, not a that kind of a person. So this is how I show up. And so we start to think of ourselves as we have only this range because this is what we tap into on a day-to-day basis, right? Yeah. But as a facilitator, I think you have a responsibility to really step into a much broader range to say, how do I show up in the way that my audience needs me to be in order to achieve the results that I've promised them or the results that they came for? And so sometimes that's going to be the cajoling best friend, or sometimes that's going to be the nurturing mother. Sometimes that's going to be like the tough love coach, or it could be many things, and it might not be your go-to way of being, but if that's what's called for and needed, how do you seamlessly step into that energy to bring about that result? So I think as a facilitator, having confidence, modeling the energy that you want, giving people metrics by which to measure. So for example, in the exercise you're talking about and the Rochambeau so I will do a demonstration of that. So I will go around in the circle and face off with people and say, okay, now biggest fan. Now you guys are cheering. You're cheering not just like, at the playground. You are cheering for like Madonna or, the Lakers or, your favorite sports team, your favorite sport. Like, you are at a 10 out of 10 supporting this person. So I think the modeling, the demonstrations, and the transmission, and then giving them the this is not a this, it's a this. And that's part of like an instructional design parameter where you say, this is what this is and this is what this isn't. And it helps by contrast for people to measure and have a barometer to go by. So I think all of those things, you're setting a tone and showing them, this is what I mean, and this is what we are going to do. And therefore, you don't give them the option to not do it that way. And of course, everyone is going to opt in at their level of willingness, but you create the optimal blueprint. And you say, this is where we are going, and this is what it looks like. And now we are going to enact it. We are going to embody it. And so I think having that without a lot of facilitators will undercut themselves. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, I'm afraid people won't do it. And guess what? Then they won't because you don't carry you don't carry the energy of like, we're going to do this. It's going to be awesome. Let's go. I think that carries, like, there's so much when you stand in front of a room that people are reading about you way more than we want to admit is true, because then it would be really scary to stand in front of a group. But there's so much that we give off based on, as we all know, right, in this, our presence, our facial expressions, our body language, our gestures that communicate far beyond whatever we say or do. And our audience is picking up on that all the time, whether that's participants in a workshop, your team that you lead, like, everything is communicating all the time. So the more that you are aware of that, conscious of that, and able to leverage.
I was going to say using that,
right? So we're not hiding behind everything. You can actually reveal your challenges, your fears, your frustrations in a way that is modeling, again, what you want your group to be doing. Then you can do that in a very empowered way.
In the last 2 years, and certainly since I saw you last, you're a mother, which I know has been a long time dream for you and your partner.
Yeah.
What have you learned over, the decades of experience facilitating and leading groups and leading experiences that you are bringing into parenthood? And then also, what have you learned in the last year and a half about parenthood that you are now bringing back into the workplace?
That's really good questions. So let's see. I think it's easier for me to maybe start with the second part. So what I'm learning about parenthood that I'm bringing back into work has to do with a lot with like having, in the airplane when it's like, put on your own mask before you put on the mask of others. And this whole idea that to show up well as a parent, I need to take care of myself and I need to have much better boundaries than I have had in the past with my work and my life. And what's interesting is I have been, as you know, such a career and purpose-driven person forever. And now in a relationship that's coming up on 10 years, now with this baby, literally the moment that Elowen came out of my body, it's like my priorities completely reorganized themselves. And again, it wasn't a conscious, I'm going to do this differently now. It was like, no, your life is now completely upside down. I was like, okay, cool. And so, it's just been a very interesting thing for me to find myself in a place where my family life feels more important than my work life. And so how does that actually play out in a day-to-day or week-to-week or year-to-year business plan, or how do I structure my time? And so I've been trying to set really clear boundaries with my team on like, these are my work hours. This is when I'm available. After these hours, please do not text me. Like, I do not want to answer a text at 9 p.m. when I'm putting my daughter to bed. Like, that is not where I just notice where my attention is drawn and how much I want to be fully, deeply present with my daughter when I am with her. And so that whole like being on a phone or trying to multitask, it's like, it really is not conducive to parenthood in the way that I want to do it. So I think presence is one thing that I'm getting. Presence, commitment, boundaries, both in work and in parenting. It's like when I'm in one thing, like do that one thing fully. And when I'm not, can I really put it down? And can I also feel good about the time that I spent there? It's like, I think as an entrepreneur, there's the to-do list never ends.
Yeah.
And so there's always things more that we could do and more that's pulling my attention. And one of my new intentions is to be like, how can I feel satisfied and fulfilled with the time and the energy that I put in, and then know that the rest of it is going to have to wait until the next day or the next time I have that opportunity. And also just so much more patience. I have to move way slower. Like, I just cannot. I have so many ideas and so many visions and so many things I want to bring to life. And I literally do not have the capacity that I did before. I could choose to do those things, but it would come at a price that I'm not willing to pay. And other people have different ways of doing it, and they're fine working 80-hour weeks with small children, and there's no judgment there on that. I have come to discover that it's not the way that I want to do things at this point in my life. I think maybe part of that is because it took us 5 years to have this child and so much trial and tribulation and intervention. It's not just like we got pregnant, now we're having, it's like, I think there's a little bit more pressure and importance on it, because you're like, wow, this is really special. We worked really, really hard to get here, and I really want to enjoy this and be present for it, because it's just so precious and it's so beautiful. And I'm such I think with experience design, and I love, as I said, all the meta stuff. So with experience design, I love training people. I love teaching people how to do this. It's like so fulfilling for me. And so with my daughter, it's also just so cool to watch her learn how she learns, where she, how she picks things up. And I think as facilitators of her world, my husband and I are holding a very wide container. Like, we're trying to be very, I think, just give the minimum amount of structure to give her the maximum amount of freedom and discovery. And, she's so playful and she's so happy. She's super adventurous, crazy coordinated. Like, I'm just in awe of her every day. And she brings this magic to every moment that I'm also like, yeah, every moment can be magic if you allow it to be, right? If we bring our awareness to it. And so I think they're just in that meta learning piece. I'm having a really cool time watching how the brain works and how things come together in a way that definitely carries over to my professional life.
Cool.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Yeah. It's very rich and wild.
What have you discovered about experience design or facilitation, the structure or the doing of it, in the last couple of years that you maybe would not have guessed or not have seen coming when you sold AcroYoga and started on this quest of inquiry and building what has this next 10 years?
Yeah, I think originally when I left AcroYoga, I was very curious to go into the corporate world because it was a world I didn't know at all, a world I had avoided because I'd never had a corporate job. And I think in my mind, I had very much othered those people.
Yep.
And they felt like a mystery to me. And I was like, how do I relate to them?
What does it mean to wear a suit to work?
Yeah, and to have an office and all this schedule. So this was like a very other in my mind. And then as I started to tiptoe into that world and to start to meet people and understand how things worked, it was so clear that it was like, these people are like every other person. They're people and they play these roles and all the things. But underneath it all, my experience still is that whether I'm in a yoga studio or in a corporate boardroom, it's like people still want to feel connection. They want to feel belonging. They want to share the genuine expression of who they are. They want to feel like they're part of a community, that they're doing something meaningful. And so I think what I've learned is all of the things that I learned through AcroYoga and psychological safety and physical safety, all of those things, they still translate. And the basic human experience is the same, no matter what context you're in. And it's really just a matter of how you take the same tools, the same frameworks, and frame them to be relevant to those audiences to make it feel safe enough for people to open up. Like I get this reflection all the time from people that it's like, oh, you can do this exercise in this context, but not with these people, with this thing, but not in this thing. Or people will say to me like, wow, you have all the best people come to your events. And I'm like, yes. And what we're trying to do is create the optimal environment to bring out the best in who people really are. And I've heard David, I'm blanking on his last name right now, the CEO of 15.5, David Hassel from 15.5, when he spoke at the Culture Conference, I remember him talking about how to pull the best out of your people. And he gave this analogy of like, if you take a beautiful, coastal pine tree and you put it in the middle of a desert, it's going to wither.
Yeah.
It needs to be in the environment that will nurture its essential qualities to come to life. And so it's a simple analogy, but I think it's very powerful in that if you put people in the right environment, if you give them the right tools, if you create the right culture, people will naturally express their highest capabilities and possibilities. And so I feel like that's really, in many ways, the job of an experience designer, facilitators, to create that containers, to create that culture that uplifts people and allows them to feel safe to be their best selves.
I have some just like very selfish Zander Media questions, right? Which is, it's sweet too, because so much of what I learned about curating Design for Dance, my original conference, and then Responsive, like you were a big part of helping me figure out how to design Responsive conference, which, right, I always describe it as like a circus performer had never been to a business conference and put on a business conference about the future of work, right?
Yeah.
Like, and you were a part of that. And so now, for example, we have a 60-minute meeting on Mondays to cover work for the week across, 7 to 12 person team, depending on independent contractors and how you count. Or we just did a 3-day offsite for Zander Media. We're doing sort of on a trimester basis, 2.5, 3 days of the whole team, wherever they are in the world, coming together consistently to spend time together in person, not doing work, but talking about the business and building the business. Simultaneously, as you're talking about facilitation, I have this idea that every single person, not just Robin, the founder and CEO of Zander Media, but every single person who works in the company or every single person who's in a meeting has the capacity to be a facilitator and to facilitate towards what they want and hopefully what they want where it aligns with what the organization wants. What advice would you give me, or what advice would you give to any business of like, here's how to run a meeting better, or here's how to run an offsite better? Either of those examples that you're excited for. And if you have clarifying questions first, by all means.
Well, I mean, first of all, just what I hear and what you're saying is already you're like many steps forward in the sense that like you have these regular touch points with the totality of your team and making the effort. I think as we all know, like we're in a very distributed workforce right now, and some companies and teams don't have the ability to meet in person, but if you do, it's so powerful. Like there's so much we can do online, and there's something about that 3-dimensional time and space that is just very accelerates, I think, the process of bonding and connection and trust and rapport and all of that. So it sounds to me already like you're way on the right track of just having those regular touch points where people know like, oh, there's going to be a moment for us to have this conversation and also be face to face. And that in those 3-day offsites, like you're spending time on the bigger picture and not in the weeds as much. So I think that's great. With any engagement, whether it's a meeting, an offsite, a workshop, whatever it is, I would always say to people, the beginning sets the tone for everything to come. So those first moments, what happens when people jump on the Zoom line? What happens when they arrive? What does the first session look like?
I think I learned in Psychology 101 in undergrad, people remember the first experience, the end of the experience, and the summary of the experience.
Yeah. So those are really important touch points. And I would say the beginning more important than anything else, because anytime you are initiating an event, a meeting, anything like that, you have the possibility to create a world, to create a mini universe. And Priya Parker talks a lot about this in her work as well. So when you step into that world, it's like it can be anything as long as you're intentional and explicit. Right? So how do you, or whoever is leading the meeting or the offsite, get clear about the kind of culture, the way that you want people, not the what. The what is important, but here we're talking a little bit more about the how people are engaging, how they're connecting with each other. And some of the ways that we do that is thinking about guidelines. You could call them rules of engagement, right? Like I always think about guidelines as the mindsets. What are the mindsets that we're asking people to try on for this period of time so that they get the most out of the experience, whatever that experience is. So if you're in a decision-making, like, okay, we're having this meeting and it's about decision making. Like, what is the guideline? What is the mindset that you want to impart to people that you think is going to help them be able to come to that decision faster, easier, in a more committed way, whatever that is. And then, like, designing a process that then engages them. Because one of the things I say to people is, like, if you are not engaging people, like, nothing else beneficial is going to happen, right? If you can't get and keep people's attention, you cannot have impact. And the reality is that our adult attention span is at 8 seconds, like average. It's so fast. So in any kind of meeting, right, can you be thinking about, I always suggest to people, think about breaking up your content into 5-minute sections. And after every 5 minutes, what's an element of engagement that you can put in, whether it's raise your hand if this, put something in the chat, launch a poll, do a breakout, do some here's a writing prompt. I want everyone to write down the top 3 things that you think we could do to improve XYZ about our business or whatever it is. So it's just like, how do you not just, I think meetings especially tend to be a one-way kind of dump of, like, information dissemination of, like, here's what you need to know. But then also, how do we get these moments of, like, how do we get people engaged? How do we get them responding, interacting, contributing? Because that's when people feel seen, heard, and valued. And so that's what we want to do in any engagement. So I'd say beginning is the most important thing. And the most important thing I'd say is start with connection, because that sets the tone for everything else. So whether that's like a chat, a prompt chat that people are filling out, there's some music going, whether it's a short icebreaker, 5 or 10 minutes, you send people into breakouts, or if you're in person, you actually have something going, and you could even designate that to different people on your team each time to come with a different game or activity that they want to share with the group and lead, which is really nice. And then some kind of guidelines or, invitations, mindsets of ways for people to engage with whatever you're doing. And then how can you really keep that engagement strong throughout your program, whatever it is. I think those would be some high-level things I would think about.
As an acrobat and a performer, like, my mantra is just rehearsal, right? And it's fun. Now, several years into making videos professionally at Zander Media, there's a rule at least for us at Zander Media, but probably pretty universal in film, which is the more time spent in pre-production, the easier post-production is. The more time you spend in preparation, the easier creating the final result is going to be after it's filmed. And what I hear you say, too, it's back to kind of where you started, is what is the outcome that you want, and working backwards to construct the process that will land the group there.
Yes. And I always think about anytime you gather a group, there's a sacred contract, right? There's you as the leader, the facilitator of the meeting or the program. We're asking people for their time, energy, and attention, which is the most precious resource any of us have, right? So it's like, I'm giving you an hour of my life. What are you going to do with it? And to really, I think, take that in as someone who is bringing people together, not in a way that's paralyzing, but in a way that honors the fact that, like, this is a precious resource. How do I make the best use out of this live group time, which is different than asynchronous, which is different than one-on-one. It's like really we want to optimize for that live group experience, and that's its own animal that has different parameters than anything else.
Yeah. Jenny, this is incredible. Obviously, we could keep going for hours, and hopefully less than 7 years from now, we'll do a round 3.
Yes, please.
For folks listening and watching, where can they go to learn more of your work across the internet?
So many places. If you want to connect with me personally, I'm Jenny at jennysauerklein.com, SAUERKLEIN. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. Scalingintimacy.com is the website where we offer experience design trainings and facilitation trainings, private team trainings, public stuff. We do all the things, and consulting also. And then playonpurpose.com is that repository of over 80 in-person and virtual team building games and icebreakers where you can learn through these video tutorials so that anyone, whether you're new to facilitation or you've been doing it for decades, you'll instantly expand your repertoire and be able to keep it fresh and bring new content to engage and connect your groups.
Awesome. Thank you for taking this time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Great to see you again after so long.